It begins with a name most people in this region have forgotten, or pretend to forget. A name whispered in old diaries, in brittle letters tied with twine, in the last gasps of the dying who wished the memory gone. But the records remain. Not many would believe a family could consume their own bloodline in such a literal, unspeakable way. Yet history, if you look deep enough, has no shortage of horrors. This one, however, is different. This one was buried under more than just dirt and dust. It was sealed under shame. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Buried Truths. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. Because once you hear it, you won't be able to pretend it didn't happen. It was the winter of 1912 when the frost refused to thaw and the snow piled so high it cut off the small settlement of Hollow Creek from the outside world. Crops had long since rotted under ice. Livestock froze in their stalls, their bodies stiff and glazed with white frost. The town kept to itself, burning through dwindling supplies, rationing bread and dried beans. But there was one family, whose name I will share in due course, that stopped appearing in church, that pulled their shutters tight, that let the smoke from their chimney turn a strange, oily black. People whispered that they were just avoiding illness. Others muttered something uglier. Children were told not to wander past the bend in the road where their farmhouse sat in its shadow. The truth would not be spoken aloud for decades, but it was already rotting behind those walls. When spring came, and the thaw finally reached Hollow Creek, the ground around the house was soft again, revealing shallow pits. The authorities who entered did not speak of what they found in their official reports. The pages are blank where their notes should be. Yet tucked in the archives of a nearby county, there photographs, faded, distorted by time, showing not just empty rooms, but piles of bones stripped too clean to be animal. Someone had lived here through that long winter, and they had eaten. By the time the snow melted that year, the stench had already seeped into the boards of the old house. The locals avoided the property entirely, some claiming they saw figures moving inside long after it was said to be abandoned. But a single official record survives, a report filed under a different township's name to avoid attaching it to Hollow Creek. It was written by Sheriff Elias Crowder, a man who would never again speak of the case in public. His words, shaky and uneven on the page, describe entering the farmhouse and finding the kitchen table still set. 4 plates, mismatched, dusted with crumbs so stale they had petrified. Beside them sat utensils, each one bent and dulled from scraping too hard against bone. There was no food in the pantry, not even a potato peel or moldy heel of bread. But on the floor beneath the table, hidden beneath an old quilt, was a heap of burlap sacks tied at the top. When the sheriff cut one open, he found something inside that made him retch. A small collection of human bones, some cracked open, hollowed out, the marrow long gone. The family was named Weatherby, Joseph and Ruth, along with their 3 children, Martha, Samuel, and a boy barely out of infancy, whose name is now lost. They had been respectable enough before the winter of 1912, quiet, self-reliant, known for keeping to themselves. But isolation can twist the mind, especially when paired with starvation and the bitter cold. Neighbors remembered Ruth as having the look of a frightened animal in the months before the snow came. She had taken to staring into the distance as if she saw something approaching no one else could. Joseph, on the other hand, grew more short-tempered, barking at anyone who came too close to their land. When the sheriff pressed surviving neighbors for more, they hesitated. One old woman finally said, "We heard crying in the night, but not the crying of children. No, it was deeper, hungrier." The Weatherby family was never buried in consecrated ground. The remains were collected quietly and burned, though some locals insist that wasn't enough. They say the land itself remembers what happened, that the soil is tainted, and anything planted there grows twisted. The deeper you dig into the Weatherby case, the less it resembles a story of simple starvation. Starving people can do terrible things, yes, but there was something ritualistic about what the sheriff found, something deliberate. In the sheriff's original notes, pages that were later misplaced by county records, there's mention of a locked chest found in the attic. Inside were scraps of parchment, torn from what looked like an old family Bible. But instead of scripture, the margins were filled with scrawled handwriting and a cramped, uneven script. It wasn't Joseph's handwriting. It wasn't Ruth's either, according to surviving samples. The language was strange, English words mixed with archaic phrases, almost like someone copying lines from an older tongue. One repeated sentence stood out. The flesh sustains, the blood binds, the marrow remembers. There were drawings too, crude sketches of the family seated around a table, but in each one, their faces seemed wrong. Eyes too large, teeth too many, and mouths drawn open wider than human anatomy should allow. The sheriff ordered the chest destroyed, but the deputy, curious and perhaps too bold, kept a single scrap. That piece, now brittle and smoke-stained, turned up decades later in a private collector's archive. On it, in faded ink, was a date, February 14th, 1913. Beside it, the words, "The boy was the first." This changed everything. It meant they didn't wait until they were near death from hunger. The act was intentional, premeditated. Someone, maybe all of them, had decided that consuming one of their own was the way to survive. But for what? Locals whispered that the Weatherbys weren't the first to turn to such meals in that valley. Some believed an older family, long before the town was founded, had made a pact during a brutal winter, one that demanded human flesh as an offering to something deep in the earth. See, whispers were never written down in any church record, but old people still lowered their voices when speaking of it. And when the snow fell again in Hollow Creek, some swore they could hear knocking beneath the floorboards of the old Weatherby place. Not footsteps, knocking, steady and patient, as though something was waiting for the next family to move in. The last living witness to the Weatherbys was a woman named Edith Crowley, who, at the time of the incident, was only 16. By the time an interviewer tracked her down in the 1970s, she was nearly blind and bedridden, her voice thin as paper. But her mind was sharper than anyone expected. Edith claimed she had been sent to the Weatherby house the day before the tragedy to deliver milk and a loaf of bread. When she reached the porch, the front door was cracked open just enough for her to see inside. She didn't knock. She said she couldn't. Something about the smell in the air made her feet root to the floor. "It wasn't the smell of death," she whispered to the interviewer. "Not yet. It was sweet. Like roasted meat, only wrong. You could taste it before you breathed it." She swore she heard voices inside, not speaking in English. At first she thought it might be German, her grandmother's native tongue, but the cadence was off, more guttural, broken by strange clicks in the throat. She couldn't see who was talking, but she saw a shadow on the far wall. It didn't match the figure that cast it. Edith didn't stay long. She left the bread and milk on the porch and fled without looking back. But that night, she woke to the sound of scratching at her bedroom window. She lived on the second floor. For years, she kept silent, even when the news broke of the Weatherbys' deaths. She told herself she had imagined it, that the hunger in the house had driven her mind to conjure horrors that weren't there. But decades later, she finally admitted the part she had never told anyone. On the night she heard the scratching, she also heard a voice, low and dry as winter leaves. It said her name. After that night, Edith never went near the Weatherby house again, but she never left Hollow Creek either. "It's safer here," she told the interviewer, "because it knows me, and if it knows you, it follows you." By the time her story was transcribed, Edith had passed away. The notes were filed, then lost. Only a few yellowed pages remain in a private collection, and they end abruptly, mid-sentence. No one knows what she said before the tape cut off. The official record states that the Weatherby home was boarded up within a week of the incident. The reasoning given was structural instability and public health risk. But the handful of local deputies who'd gone inside that night told a different story, one they later denied under oath. Those who spoke privately described the house as unnaturally cold, even though it was midsummer. The air clung to the lungs, damp and heavy, and every step up the staircase sounded wrong, like they were walking on something hollow beneath the boards. Sheriff Caldwell, a man known for his skepticism, led the group. They made their way to the kitchen first, where the smell Edith described still hung in the air. There were no plates, no silverware, only a single cast iron pot on the stove. Inside was nothing but a thick, dark residue, baked into the metal. One deputy swore the residue was still warm to the touch, though the stove had no fire beneath it. The upstairs rooms were worse. Dust lay thick on every surface, except for one door at the end of the hall. The handle was polished bright, as though it had been turned often. When they opened it, they expected a bedroom. Instead, they found a narrow passage, sloping down at an angle that shouldn't have been possible in the house's layout. The passage led to a cramped cellar space no one in town had known existed. It was not on the original blueprints, and its walls were lined with shelves holding dozens of glass jars. Some were filled with pale, unrecognizable shapes suspended in brine. Others contained nothing but cloudy liquid, the kind that made the skin tingle when the deputies touched the jars. But the worst was in the center of the room. A wooden table, deep grooves cut into its surface, as though someone had clawed at it over and over. Sheriff Caldwell ordered the room sealed and told his men to forget what they'd seen. That night, the house was boarded up. The cellar was never officially recorded, and the blueprints were quietly altered in county records. Yet within months, strange rumors began to circulate, of animals going missing near the house, of distant tapping sounds heard from inside at night. No one was willing to go back inside to check. The house still stands today, leaning slightly to one side. But the boards over the door never seemed to hold for long. Decades passed, and the Weatherby name faded into little more than a local ghost story, told to scare children into behaving. But in 1987, a young man named Thomas Rourke bought the property at a tax auction for a mere $4,000. He wasn't a local. He'd grown up in Chicago and had no ties to the town's whispers. All he saw was a fixer-upper on cheap land. Neighbors tried to warn him. They told him about the smell, about the strange cold inside, and about the boards that never stayed nailed down. He laughed it off as country superstition. The week he moved in, he began tearing down the boards himself, determined to open the place up. Thomas was a carpenter by trade, and he worked fast. Within 2 days, he'd cleared the main rooms and stripped away the decades-old dust. That's when he noticed the strange slant in the upstairs hallway, the same one Sheriff Caldwell had seen years earlier. He found the polished door handle and the narrow passage exactly as it had been left. The air that rushed out was damp and carried the faint metallic tang of old blood. But Thomas was a practical man. He told himself it was just stagnant air. The cellar was almost unchanged. The jars still sat on their shelves, though many were now clouded with mold, their contents even less recognizable. The claw-marked table was there too, though the grooves seemed deeper somehow. He examined one of the jars, holding it up to the weak light from his flashlight. Inside was something that looked disturbingly like a human hand, small, like a child's, but the proportions were wrong. The fingers bent backward at unnatural angles. That night, Thomas heard sounds, faint at first, soft tapping, like knuckles on wood, but soon escalating into something sharper, like nails dragging along the walls. The sound came from beneath the floorboards, moving slowly from one end of the house to the other. On the third night, the tapping stopped, but Thomas woke to find all the jars in the cellar had been rearranged. The hand-like object was now placed front and center on the table, as if it were waiting for him. By the fourth day, Thomas was gone. His truck was still parked outside, tools neatly arranged in the back. The front door hung open, swinging in the wind. No one ever saw him again. The only clue was a single jar, left on the porch, filled with clear liquid and something floating inside. Something that looked a lot like a tongue. The Weatherby property was sealed again after Thomas's disappearance, but the sheriff's office, under quiet pressure from the state, finally allowed a specialized investigative team to enter. This wasn't publicized. The townsfolk woke one morning to find unmarked vans at the edge of the property, and men in plain clothes moving in and out with crates. One of those men, a retired crime scene photographer named Harold Kinney, later broke his silence. In his account, delivered years later, while drunk in a dingy bar, he claimed the house was wrong in ways that couldn't be explained by neglect or age. The air was heavy, pressing down on your chest. Shadows didn't fall where they should. And the smell, Harold swore it wasn't rot, but something warm and wet, like breath. They found more than a hidden cellar. In the far corner, behind a false wall, was a narrow staircase spiraling downward, much deeper than any basement should go. The deeper they descended, the warmer the air became, until it felt humid, almost alive. The walls were slick, covered in a dark film that gleamed under the flashlight beams. At the bottom, they entered a chamber unlike anything Harold had ever seen. The space was circular, the walls lined with more shelves of jars, but these weren't filled with cloudy liquids. They were dry, each one holding fragments of bone, tiny teeth, locks of hair. A crude altar stood in the center, made from nailed-together floorboards. On top was something wrapped in stained cloth. When one investigator unwrapped it, the room fell silent. Inside was the upper half of a human skull, small enough to belong to a child, but its proportions were wrong. The jawbone jutted forward, the eye sockets unusually wide. Around the skull's edges, remnants of flesh still clung, though it was leathery with age. As they packed the evidence, Harold swore he heard movement, not from above, but furrows, the walls themselves. A slow, rhythmic sound, like something shifting in the dark just beyond sight. One man dropped his crate and refused to continue. The team left by nightfall, locking the property tight. Within days, official records of the investigation were sealed under the guise of unspecified environmental hazard. Harold was never called to testify. The Weatherby house still stands, rotting quietly at the edge of town. Locals say on certain nights, you can see a light in the cellar window, swinging slowly, like someone walking with a jar in hand. No one stays to see who, or what, it is. Every story leaves a scar. Drop yours in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Something is always listening.